Okay, so welcome. We are going to be looking at how we use Visual Studio, specifically with developing a game in Unreal Engine. So you can use Unreal Engine just on its own with Blueprint without having to write any code. But if you're looking to develop using native or C++ in order to code functionality and anything in your game, or even if you want to try and understand the kind of the engine code, it's going to be really useful for you to have an IDE, a program that you can use to read and conveniently write code as you go. And I've been using Visual Studio since I started, and we're going to be having a look at setting up Visual Studio to be developing a game in Unreal. And we're going to go right from the start, and then we're going to go through to some kind of really useful tips that I've picked up working in industry using Visual Studio with Unreal Engine over the last few years. So, any questions in the chat, do feel free to ask. Let me just close down the project that we've currently got up. We don't need to save what we've got. And we're going to start from the beginning as if I'm not going to go teach you how to go to the website and download Visual Studio. We're not going to go quite that basic all the way through, but we're going to go from the start as if you've just got a clean install. So what we're going to do, the first thing that we're going to check out is how we reset your kind of Visual Studio setup back to basics, because it's helpful for me to do that so that we're working from a similar place. So you can go down to this import and export settings, and that lets you reset all of the settings back to basic, and that'll change the layout of my window a little bit at the moment. So if you're ever doing this, it's a quite useful feature. You can export your settings as well. So if you ever do want to reformat your computer, you can export your Visual Studio settings, and then you can import them on the new formatted computer install and have all the windows set up in the way that you like as well. So yeah, but I've backed mine up already, so I'm just going to go ahead and reset. It tries to encourage you to save them. I'm going to say no again. And then it tells you what you want as your default settings. So we're going to be developing in C++ for Unreal. So we click the CPP one, and then if I click finish, we won't see that much change, but there'll be definitely some changes in the window now. I don't know. Yeah, there we go. So it's gotten rid of the layout that I had. It's closed some of the windows that I'd manually opened. And it may have also changed some of the stuff up in this toolbar. I'm not too sure if it actually... Yeah, it has changed some of that stuff as well. So we're going to go run through how I got it to the way that I like to work. So first thing that I'd like to show you as well is the kind of install that you need for Visual Studio. It should be quite self-explanatory, but if you were to go to your Visual Studio installer, once you've this is how you get it in the first place. So if you haven't downloaded it yet, download it. I use Visual Studio Community 2019. A lot of this is available in 2017 as well. You install it, but then if you go into modify, you can get back to the screen you see when you're installing it, which is like, what added extras do you want to include? So we'll open this a bit bigger so we can see what it looks like on the screen right now. And the main thing that you care about, I've got a few tick boxes in here that you don't definitely need. I've done some Unity development in the past as well. I've done some .NET development. Well, I've done a small amount of that. But the main one that we're interested in is this game development with CPP. So make sure that you've got that one ticked. There are some guidelines online you can find to specifics, but I think if you were to do the game development with CPP, it does kind of install a bunch of stuff automatically for you. And these optional ones, I can't remember if they're on by default, but these are the ones that are recommended to have on. It does recommend having this SDK installed as well. I've probably got a SDK, maybe a later version installed already, which is maybe why that is unticked at the moment. But yeah, so make sure that you've got that set up, and then your Visual Studio is going to be in a place where it's ready for you to do some development within an Unreal project. So yeah, that's the first step. And then the second thing that I'd recommend doing, and this is quite an important one if you're going to be using debugging, debugging being one of the most useful things that you get out of something like Visual Studio, is you want to make sure that based on what engine version you're using in Unreal, you want to make sure that you've got the debug symbols. What that allows you to do is you can debug not just your own code, but you can debug the engine code. And when you start off in game development, that might not be something you need to do very often. But I can say definitely from day-to-day stuff, using it is really handy to be able to jump into certain engine code and hit breakpoints and be able to debug it efficiently. So let's make sure that we've got those debug symbols. So let me just have a quick catch up on chat before I do. So Pally, hopefully you're going to survive despite the low battery. Partly no, we're not going to learn how to game development with Unity today. This is Unreal. Oh, you are okay. Well, let us know when you are back, Mr. Partly, and we'll carry on. And Pally, I'm glad to hear that you're plugged in and safely here with us. All right, so as I was saying, we're going to go to make sure that we've got the debug symbols for our engine version. These are kind of like the two prerequisites, I guess, before we get started. Make sure that your Visual Studio has the C++ dependencies kind of installed. And then when we're in our Epic Games launcher, which is how you typically launch any games you've bought on Epic, but more importantly, in this case, it lets us go to our library, which shows the different versions that we have installed. When you're on this screen, we're going to be working in 25 today. My project is in 4.25. You click on the down arrow next to the version, and you go into Options. And it's this list here. This is the important one where you'll find this, editor symbols for debugging. It's a hefty download. It almost doubles what you need installed. So if you're downloading many versions of the engine, you can see I've got 4 already. Just be aware of how much space it takes. And if you stop using a version, you might want to get rid of that to save your hard disk some space, I guess. But yeah, make sure you've got that ticked. It will download it. If not, it'll take a little bit of time. But that is going to allow us to be able to hit breakpoints in the engine code as well as our own code. Yeah, very annoyed. It's definitely something that takes a bit more space on the hard drive these days. Yeah, download speeds these days definitely helps. I'd imagine doing this on 56K would not have been the most painless of processes. But yeah, once that's done, that means that you'll be able to debug the engine code as well. So the next step then, you would pretty much be working in VS then. So there's 2 ways. Let's say that you'd started a new project. Let's close Visual Studio for now. What happens when you make a new project is it'll ask you, is your project going to be a code-based project or is it going to be a blueprint-only based project? Now, if you choose blueprint-only when you make a project, it won't make the Visual Studio kind of file stuff for you. So it's important that if you're planning to code in it, even if you're not going to code when you're prototyping some stuff out, that you make your project the Visual Studio based one. And that'll give you some of the things that I'm going to show you in a moment. So let's just open up a project, because when you create a project from start, you go straight through Unreal and then it launches the editor without you even needing to touch Visual Studio. So let's go ahead and open a project. So I'll go into Kattenberg, one of the projects we're currently working on. And what we're going to... Uh-oh. Why is this entry point not found? That is less helpful. Game module Kattenberg couldn't be loaded. This is not what we planned for. At all. Okay, let's try this a different way. Take two. I normally don't launch my games through the launcher this way. This isn't your typical way of doing it. I just wanted to put you in that situation. Let's try and launch the engine version first, and then we'll choose Kattenberg, and we'll see what happens then. This might be a case that... no, it hasn't been relocated. It is a bit concerning that it's done that. Let's see. So this is where you would make a new project that I was on about. You'd choose game, you'd go to next, and then you would choose what type of template you want. And this is what I was on about. You choose whether or not you're going to do it in Blueprint or CPP. So make sure you choose CPP if you're ever going to use CPP, just so it does that initial setup for you and make things a lot easier. But let's go and see if Kattenberg works this time. Please work for us. Thank you, Dread, for the follow as well. Welcome along. There we... No! What happened to my project? Why is it dead? Okay, we're going to try and do some troubleshooting around this quickly. I'm not 100% why it's not working for us. Well, the engine's already closed. I mean, I could close the launcher. Yeah. The other thing I'm going to do quickly... Don't worry about this step for now. This is just me debugging why I can't open my project. But let's also just do this quickly. I was literally in this project. We were, so before this part of the stream, we were playing around in Kattenberg. Okay. So Nekartoffel is saying if you do start a blueprint project, the moment you add a CPP class from the editor, it will create the solution file and everything for you at that point, is it? That's good to know. That's good to know. Yeah, do feel free to give any feedback when we're going along. It'd be appreciated. All right, we're going to try one more time, and if not, we'll just launch it the normal way, all right? So we want to go into our library. We're going to go into... It's not because it's an update, is it? Because if now it's kind of forcing me to update. I'm so confused right now. Oh, is it because my current version is... No. Is it going to get that? All right, so we're having issues with that project at the moment, which is a bit of a shame, but we'll launch it the normal way, and I'll just try and show you what I meant anyway. So if we launch it the normal way, let me just go into the Visual Studio project for it. Classic. I did it yesterday, worked fine. This morning worked fine. It's all good. It's all good. We managed to break it between 2 hours ago and now. Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Breno. It may be indeed. Okay, so I'm going to do a couple of things in here just quickly. So first off, I typically use an extension called Visual Assist, which I highly recommend. I'll talk about it a little bit later. But for now, I'm going to just turn it off because we're going to go through as much as we can without using that. And then I'll do a section on trying to make it, trying to show why a lot of people use Visual Assist as a tool to develop CPP, especially Unreal Engine stuff. So let me just disable that. You'll see the syntax highlighted change, and all my shortcuts and a couple of things on the UI have disappeared now as well. But that's fine. Okay, so what I was going to show you pretty much is when you create a project, you'll just be launching the editor, and when I say editor, I mean the Unreal Engine editor, and you won't really be doing anything with Visual Studio, but what it does make for you is it'll make you the project files. So you can see that I've just gone to where my project is, and you'll have something called a SLN, which is your solution file, and this is what you'll open, like you saw me do a moment ago, to get into your project. Now, if you ever need to, well, I say if you ever, it's one of the quirks with Unreal Engine development is as you add more stuff to your project, you kind of need to update the solution to know about all of the new files and changes to your project. And so you do something called generate project files. And one of the things I used to joke about all the time with a couple of my friends when we're developing is like, if you've got if you can't compile or something's going wrong, it's one of those things you're like, maybe I just need to generate Visual Studio project files. It's a little bit black magic-y if you've not really gone into this area before. But you run that, and what it does is it'll generate a new solution for us, and it'll give you a warning once it's finished in the editor to pretty much say, oh, this has changed, I need to refresh normally. And so you'd refresh if there'd been any changes based on that. But I'd run that before, so there's no real changes for me. Now, once you've done that, you're essentially able to work entirely from Visual Studio, and we're not gonna, from now on, we're not gonna be launching our project from Epic Games Launcher. That's not just because of the glitch I had earlier, but generally when I work, I don't use the Epic Launcher at all. You can actually launch your project if you're in the solution. Let me just go into my solution rather than in a piece of engine code. I've got quite a few of engine code files open at the moment, but yeah, if you're in a solution, as long as you're in it, you can attach with debugger, and that will launch the editor for you and allow you to actually debug when you need to as well. So that's typically how I would launch my game to test it out in editor, is I would do it straight from Visual Studio, and I pretty much recommend you do the same thing as well. So first thing, let's have a look about setting up VS now that we've gotten over that little bit of kerfuffle with trying to open our project. So some of the things that I like to do when setting up VS initially is there is an extension called UnrealVS, which is the official from Epic. They make a small extension to help with a couple of things. So we're first going to go through trying to set that up. It's not hard to do at all. You basically, if there is a link I can drop in chat now, but if you were to go to this web page here, it'll tell you what you need to do, but I'll just show you quickly. it talks you through setting it up and where to install it. But effectively, wherever your engine is installed, the extension will be there as part of that installation. So if we were to just go to where we've installed it, now I've got a custom installation directory because I've got multiple hard drives as well. So I think mine is going to be in my D drive Unreal, and then I've got my different versions in here. So if I go into the current version that I'm using, and then if you go into, I think it's engine, plugins, no, not plugins. Let me just check where it is. I found it earlier. Where is it? Engine extras. That's what it is, not plugins. There we go. And then you've got something called UnrealVS in here. So based on what version of Visual Studio you're using, you would find the installer in there. Brainoid, I know earlier in chat you said that you need to do this so you can follow along. So let's go into here. And then you can basically double click it and go through an installer to set it up. Now I think it's already installed on mine because I've installed the plugin, and when I reset mine, it doesn't like uninstall your plugin for you. But if I try and do it again, I'm not too sure whether it'll say anything. Yeah, okay, there we go. It says it's already installed. Fantastic. So if not, it'll essentially pop up with a dialog. To be honest, I can probably uninstall it, no problem. So if we just go into extensions quickly, go into installed, UnrealVS, and we just uninstall it here, then we can see what that process is. So I need to go ahead and close Visual Studio. He'll sort that out for me. There you go. It's pretty much the same window we see when we install it. You are following along. How delightful, Brainoid. I'm glad you're getting something out of it, at least. You'd expect. It's really quick to install, so it's surprising it takes quite a bit to remove it, but there we go. Okay, it's done. Close. Right, so how it would happen, one thing that catches me out all the time is I try and run it when Visual Studio is open already. And you essentially need to close it for it to work that way. So when you install it, it'll say waiting for these things, and sometimes I don't focus and I just leave that window thinking it's installing, but no, you need to make sure that Visual Studio is closed before you do that. So look, I'll go ahead and do it now. This project is loading in the background. We'll probably wait until it loads just to keep it happy. Yeah, that sounds good to me. Okay, so let's go ahead and I'll also let me just go to Visual Assist and turn it off. I'll have to do that every time I relaunch, but I just want my editor to my Visual Studio to look like yours if you're on a fresh install. Okay, so if I now install it, this is the screen I was on about before. That I think it's installing now, so I just leave it on one screen after I press install. So I think it's installing, and I go off and do stuff, and I come back and realize, oh, it actually can't start because this basically means you've got Visual Studio open. So if you just close Visual Studio down, that'll then go ahead and resume itself. I think it should update and notice that you've closed it down in just a moment. There you go, and it'll finish installing it there. Thank you, Booksnell. Nice to have you here. Outfrost asking, did I install VS? No, I did not. Not install it on the D drive. I don't think VS is too chunky compared to Unreal downloads, at least. When we're talking around 50 gig for each version of Unreal, definitely needed it on a bigger hard drive than my main one. Okay, so that is installed now. And what that means is when you launch Visual Studio, you will have yourself. It's a few extra options. It's not a massive amount, but depending on how you use Visual Studio for Unreal development, it basically depends on your project. If you're in a big team working on maybe a AAA game where you're having to maybe you're pushing builds to Team City, maybe you've got server code and client code, different code running on a server, different code running on clients. There's some tools in UnrealVS that are useful for that, but there's still some tools which are super handy regardless. So we'll go through and I'll show you how that is set up now. Okay, so as always, I'm just going to come in and disable Visual Assist. There we go. Hopefully we don't have to restart the Visual Studio application too many times now. So if I was to right click, I now have the option to show the Visual VS toolbar. So all that's going to do is add on, you see these groups of buttons. Every time you see one of these kind of dividers, that's a new group of buttons. It's going to add on the ability to have the UnrealVS version of it. So the UnrealVS version adds a few things in. This is it here. It's just plonked itself in the middle. You can reposition these around on the toolbar as you please. But I just want to talk about what's important here. So one thing I would do, some features in Visual Studio will rely on you having a startup project selected. So generally speaking, whatever your main project is, if you're working on a game solo, you're probably just going to have one project here. You'll have Unreal Engine and then you'll have your work, right? So just make sure that you've gone ahead and you've gone to set up startup project on your project. That will change what is in this drop down here. If I was to change it to this, for example, you'll see that has changed to UE4 then, which is going to make some things not work. So you make sure that you've got your own project set up as your startup project. You know, once you've done that once, you won't have to do that every time you load in at least. Okay, so we've got these 4 things set up. One of them is just telling you what startup project you're using. If you're not using more than one startup project, realistically, you don't need this. You can probably just drop that off. Now, this is quite handy. This is a command line kind of parameters that you can add on, and I'll show you some of the cool things you can do with that, or one of the cool things especially you can do with that. This button here is really nice. So if you remember earlier, I showed you the weird thing you do where you go, if we go back to where I was in my project, here we go in Kattenberg, that generate project files. So instead of always having to go to this location to do it, you can use this button here, this refresh projects. That will also generate your project files for you. It saves you. I didn't know this for so long, and I always had to jump into File Explorer, go to where my project is, right click, generate project folders, project files. And yeah, it's just a bit of a faff, especially if you're doing it regularly. So yeah, that's handy. That's there for you there. And then we have this button here for the batch builder. So I'll talk through them, but first off I want to show you that you can actually just get rid of stuff you don't need, and this is true for any of the toolbars at the top. The little drop down at the end, add remove buttons, and you can just get rid of the things that you're not going to use. So as I said, with start a project, generally speaking, I'm not going to change mine, so I'm going to get rid of that, because my aim really with setting up Visual Studio is to make it get rid of things that I don't use. Because if you've got a toolbar full of buttons and boxes that you don't either 1 use or 2 know what they do, then they're just making it harder for you to access the few things on there that you do know what they do. So I like to try and clean down the things that I don't use. So the command line I do use, the refresh projects I do use, and the batch builder I probably don't use, I won't use on a small project like this, but I definitely use it in work projects. I've used it plenty. And I'll show you what it is before I get rid of it then. So the batch builder, this allows you to essentially do a build for multiple kind of configurations for different platforms all at the same time. So normally when you're building, you'll notice up here it says that I'm in debug, whichever one of these I've chosen. You can't really see which one was selected. I'll show you how to fix that in a bit. And for Win64. So essentially that's the same as saying, right, I want to build Kattenberg for debug game editor for Win64, and you add it on. So when I press build, it's essentially just doing this. But what the batch builder allows you to do is, let's say that you've got a bunch of different configurations that you want to build for, then you can go ahead and build them all at once and compile them, and essentially see if it would run fine on all of those different configurations. This has been really useful for me, especially if your game has some like server only code and some client code. You might accidentally forget to wrap something with there's some macros UE server, for example, which will mean this code will only be compiled for server code. And so you can easily make some mistakes with some server code if you haven't implemented that correctly. And so building for both your kind of client and your server separately will help you kind of identify some of those issues. So this is where this batch builder comes in really handy, is that you can just say, right, okay, I want to do a debug game editor, a development editor, and a shipping build, all for Win64. You can add them all on here. You can remove things you don't want with the arrows, and then you can just press start and it'll go ahead and build all of them at once. Yeah, another idea is if you want to do for Android and iOS at the same time, as Andre has just said in chat, that's correct. So it really depends on your project. This doesn't have much in this window because this project hasn't had many configurations set up for it. But especially if you're building a larger project which is targeting multiple platforms, maybe has online as well, then you're going to have a bunch of different build configurations. And so this allows you to test locally. If you're working in a business that is doing this sort of project as well. Quite often they might have some remote kind of building process, like a build farm. So when you submit work, it would upload it and it will have a build farm that just is running these builds every time someone submits code. So it can report, oh, this doesn't compile, and then the build is broken. People need to fix that because you're all working off the same code base, right? So this has been useful for me because it allows me to, sometimes if I know I've been doing a lot of server client heavy code, I get to run, I kind of do a compile locally first before I even try and put my code in the repo, because it allows me to catch any of those easy to make mistakes, like I mentioned earlier. So yeah, it's pretty handy. You can kind of dock it down to the bottom of the screen as well, so it's not this pop-up. So it can be useful. For me personally, on this project, I'm not using it. So I'm going to go ahead and close it. And I'm going to take it off this menu because I don't need it. You can always get it back if you need, right? You can just come back in and enable the button. So I'm going to turn it off. It gives me one less thing. Now, I mentioned to you earlier that you can do some cool things in this box here. And this is a command line. And there's documentation you can find online about different command line kind of arguments, parameters that you can pass when you're launching an Unreal application. But one of the main uses I have of it is you can pass it like a map. So if I'm working on a test map, say I'm working on some AI, I might make an AI or Dan's AI test map. But normally when I run my project, I want it to go to the main game. You can change in Unreal what your load up map is. But if you just want to load a specific map when you're working on certain code, instead of having to find that map every time you launch, you can just put in the name of the map, like I've done here. I put in test scene. So if I don't have that, it will launch to my default startup map. But if I do go ahead and write in a name of my map, it doesn't have to give it the full folder or anything. It's just the name of your map. It will automatically look for that map and load it on startup. So if I was to launch it now, instead of going to my normal map where you'll see like the game with all the cards out on the screen, it'll just take you to this white box level that we used for some testing before. So we'll let this launch just so you can see how it works. But that is one use of this command line. And there is extra things you can do. You can launch it so it builds, you can do some things to skip some sort of compiling. You can do things to launch it without cooked assets and stuff. There's some more technical things that you need it. If you need it, you'll know you need it, right? But it's useful to have it there at least. So you can see that it's launched us into this map, and this map is my test scene instead of taking us to the normal game scene, which is our default one. So if you did want to change them in Unreal, you can go to your project settings. If you go into maps and modes, this is where you set up your editor startup map. So if you permanently want to load a specific map, just change it in here. That's no problem. But it's really handy, I find personally, to have that command line so you can just jump into a new map straight from this debugging process. Brainoid, you're saying, I remember changing the map every time I launched Unreal and I forgot to change the default map in the settings. This is really handy. Good. Thank you, Brainoid. I'm glad to hear. It's one of those things that initially I was just like, oh, you just change it in Unreal, but it definitely does have uses, and I'm finding I'm making lots of little test maps at the moment, and so it becomes more useful to me. Also, just to say, if anyone is interested in the Microsoft game stack, so that includes Visual Studio, that's what I'm doing today on this sponsored stream by Microsoft Azure, is we're looking at one element of the Microsoft game stack. If you want to learn more about the rest of the game stack, things like PlayFab, you're welcome to click on the link that's in chat at the moment. That should give you 2 links to information about the game stack so you can learn more about it. To be honest, I've used parts of the game stack, but I wasn't fully familiar with the whole, like, what is included within that term, the Microsoft game stack. So there's quite a few things you may have seen in there already, stuff that will help you get kind of online services working in your game. Obviously, Azure is kind of like you can do some web hosting or just general server hosting as well. So there's a lot of stuff in there. Feel free to have a look at the link to find out. But our focus today is the IDE element of it, which is Visual Studio. So we were just talking about this top bar up here. And one thing that I don't like about this top bar is I can't see the argument on the end of it. So I don't know if I've got anything written at the end of it. And the same that I said earlier, this top bar over here, I don't know which one I've got selected, debug game or debug game editor. It's a bit of a silly thing, but it's easy enough to fix. So all we need to do is tell these boxes to be wider. And so to do that, it's quite straightforward. you go to the end of the section that it is in. So as I said, it might be a bit difficult to see, but these little dotted dividers, that lets you know what a section is. So if you scroll until you get to the end of the next dotted divider, there'll be a little arrow. This is where we add the buttons that I've shown you earlier. So if we do it with the one we did earlier, the UnrealVS one, it makes it a little bit cleaner. We've seen this menu before. If you go into Customize, you can go in and you can change anything that is in that menu. You can change the order of them. You can do some fun stuff if you really want to customize your UI. We're going to keep it as it is by default. However, we want this field here, the command line editor, we want to make this wider. So if you go to modify, you can go ahead and you can change how wide you want this to be. Now, for some people, 200 would be fine. If your project is in the default Unreal, I think if it's in the same directory as Unreal, possibly, you might be able to just get away with chucking a project name in there, just Kattenberg, and it would launch. But if you've moved your project into a different kind of folder structure like I have, you need to fully declare it like I've done, and it ends up taking a lot of space. So I'm going to just set mine to like 325, let's say. So we do that, we press close, and you can see now that that box has gone wide, and so I can actually see what's at the end of it. You could argue it's maybe not long enough, so let's go in and fix that. Customize, and we'll take it just a little bit. Probably 350 would do. If it's not, I'm not going to keep coming in and out trial and error in this. But let's go ahead, do that. You can see it now fits it in nicely, which is good. Also, thank you for recent followers, Dread and Shabby. Good to have you here. So let's go ahead and do this. And this is important, these over here. This comes in really handy. And if you don't understand this, it's also something that I just didn't know for ages what it means. This is basically telling you when you press compile and you're going to build how much you need to build. Now, do you debug game? You basically have debug game, development, and then shipping. There may be different configurations based on your project setup. But effectively what it means is how much code and optimizations, how much code gets stripped out or optimized away. So in a shipping build, you generally want your game to have the least amount of code in it that it needs to keep the package size down and not to include debug functions that you don't need in a shipped game. You then have these two lower levels, development and debug game, and based on a bunch of rules behind the scenes, it will basically filter out different bits of your code and optimize away code based on which one of these you have selected. So the downside is I pretty much recommend that if you are going to be debugging, to just always do debug game editor. The word editor after I'm here, by the way, I should have said this earlier, basically just means it's going to build the editor for you. So pretty much if you're doing the flow that I am now, where you were doing the code and then we debug, it launches the editor and we want to work with it, you want to choose the one with the word editor after it always. You can kind of disregard these ones for now. So I tend to always recommend building a debug game editor, because if you don't, when you're debugging, you might notice, oh, why is my debugger not letting me view the value of a certain variable that I'm trying to work out what's going on with? And the reason is maybe it's been optimized away, and so it's not available to you. So that is one of the most annoying things when you're deep in the middle of debugging as well. So I tend to have it in debug game always. The downside is it's a bit slower to run and also to build possibly as well, but for smaller projects it's really not noticeable. And once you've built once, it's kind of iteratively building, right? So you don't have to rebuild the whole thing every time. So once you've done it once, it's not too big of an issue. But what we're trying to address here is basically how can we make this box bigger? And we've learned before that we can just go in, add remove buttons, and go down to the customize section, and then we just go to the line that we want. So this is our configuration. If we go modify, we can make this a better width. Let's just go 180. There you go. I can actually see what it is. You might want it a little bit shorter if you think they're not going to take that much. None of the labels are going to be that large. So yeah, we can go and probably bring that down a little bit, maybe 150. And then you can make this one as well, the 164 drop down. There's not that many options in there, and they're not very long in length either. So I'm going to go ahead and just change this one to be a little bit narrower as well. So let's change that to 80. There we go. So if I press close now, we can now, whichever one of these we choose, we can actually see what version it's on. It helps you notice if you've accidentally left it in a wrong configuration as well. If I was ever changing to these, I'd maybe want this a bit wider, but I typically just keep it on Win64 myself personally for my development. Okay, so that is how we can fix some of the kind of simple issues that have been in VS for a while, so that we know what configuration that we're building and that we're launching our editor in. Okay, so what I like to do then is to customize my toolbar and make it look how I want to. I don't know about you, but when I look up here at the 20 odd buttons I've got along here, one, I may not know what most of them do. And two, if there's too many, I find it hard to find what I'm looking to do. So what I like to do on a fresh install is just go through and remove the things that I don't know what they are, or if I ever use them. So this will be easier for you. If you're new to VS, it'll be easier to do the more you use it. But I'll try and talk through stuff which is relatively sensible that I like to get rid of. So let's go on this first group. This is your kind of standard group. If I right click and we see what kind of toolbars that we've got up here. We've got the standard, we've got one called text editor, UnrealVS, which we enabled earlier. And let me untick this visual assist one so we don't have clutter from that one. Okay, so if I get rid of text editor, you'll see that some of them disappear. So let's turn that back on. These are the ones that are default on. Right, so let's start with the main standard one. We'll go into this and right, the ones that I find useful in here, navigate forward and backwards, super handy. When you're moving through a file, it just allows you to, like in a browser, go back and forward. In a large, I use this literally all day, every day. I use back and forward. I have it bound to shortcuts. I think is Control and minus by default will take you backwards. Control Shift minus will make you go forward. Yeah, it's very valuable in larger code files or when you've got a load of different files open. I use it all the time. New project, I'm not making new project often. I don't feel I need a button for it. I could just go to the file menu if I want to. Open file. Yeah, these maybe. To be honest, I do know Control O, Control S and that, but I don't mind having those up there. I'll leave those there. Undo and redo. Now, the reason this can be more useful is if you want the undo history. You know, the drop down you've got next to it, you can have a look at the things that you've done recently. So sometimes I have a use for that, so I do leave those up there. Solution configuration we want up there, that's not a problem. There's a startup projects one that isn't showing at the moment. I've actually had it before where some of these don't show up immediately until I've restarted it. So we might need to come in and pop some of them off later. But we're just going to go through the ones that we can see up here. So I think starter project's not up there at the moment, but I know that I don't need that one displaying because we turned it off for the UnrealVS one earlier as well. Some of the things I don't use, the apply code changes, I've not had that working, but maybe it's something I don't understand. So I'm going to turn that one off. The debug type, none of these options I ever have to change. It always just does the right one for me. I've never needed to come in and change them myself. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. Where was it? Debug type. There we go. We then have browser link. No, it's not even up there. Finding files. So finding files is just a search. I just use Control Shift F. I use it often, don't get me wrong, but I'm not clicking up there to do it. So I get rid of that. The start window, I don't need that. I don't need a way to bring up that start menu that asks me what project that I want to launch. And then we have some extra ones down here that, to be honest, I think probably fine to leave them. They're not showing up for us at the moment. So if we do see them, we can always turn them off later. But that has made this a bit smaller for us now, at least. We basically just have things that we know what they do. We open, save, back and forward, undo, redo, what configuration we're building for, and the button to launch or to debug. Then we've got our UnrealVS that we've already tidied up. And then we've got another block over here, which is our editor ones, right? So let's go in. What do we need in here? Quick info. I don't use it personally. The quick info, if you hover over it, it'll just give, it's the same as doing Control K, Control I. It just tells you if it's like a member variable that you're using. So if I come into here and I do quick info, I don't know if the IntelliSense has run on this actually yet, so it might just take a moment to do. But generally when you click on it, it would just tell you where is this from, and it'll be like, this is a member of this type. So I personally don't use it. I use other tools to find that sort of information if I need to. So generally have that off, and the one next to it as well doesn't become available to us when I'm using VS as well. So I tend to turn that off because I don't like the clutter. Then we have some options here, commenting and uncommenting. This is great. This is just for turning off a block of code. But I use the shortcuts instead. So you can do Control KC to comment and Control KU to uncomment. So I tend to turn those off as well, if I'm perfectly honest with you. just to remove the clutter, because I'm mainly a keyboard user rather than a clicker. So I turn those off. Now bookmarks I actually find handy, and there's a shortcut for it, but I do keep the bookmark one up there. The one that I don't keep up with the bookmarks is the clear bookmarks, and I'll talk a bit more about bookmarks later on because they are quite handy. Okay, so there's one extra menu that I do recommend that we have on here as well, and there's one called the build menu. Now, this is useful mainly for, I mean, there's shortcuts to build. I think like Control-Shift-B will do a build. If you hover over them, it gives you shortcuts as well. Control-B does a build of your current, I think it's your starter project or current selected one, if I remember. Let's go into Unreal. Yeah, so it's not your starter project, apologies. It's whatever project you're currently selecting, or even if you're in a file that belongs to that, it will build that. So Control-B can sometimes build the wrong project if you're poking around in engine code. So you want to just, I tend to use a build full solution. That works fine for smaller projects. And you can add a button if you want to build just your startup project. And that can be useful for some projects if you've got certain things you don't want to be building all the time. Now, if I'm honest with you, the most useful thing I get out of this is this cancel button. So if I ever press compile and I'm like, oh, actually, I didn't want to compile. I wanted to compile and launch debugger. So the difference between like F7 and F5, which is the same as pressing this button here. Then I'd cancel and then I'd press the right one. So the cancel I find useful here. So I'm going to get rid of this transform Alt-4. I've never used that templates thing. I don't know what it does, if I'm perfectly honest with you. And yeah, that's fine for me having these options. If you feel that you don't want to use one or the other, you could always get rid of them too. But yeah, so that's what I normally do. And what I'd remind you about is that there is extra things in here like debug, which will give you a bunch of debug options as well. You can see them over here, like step over, step into. These are debug tools. But what you should know is when you launch the debugger, so let's turn that off. So when you actually do what I'm doing here, pressing that local Windows debugger here, what happens is you'll notice VS changes. The toolbar at the bottom, or the bar along the bottom, will change from blue to orange. And when you do that, it changes the configuration of VS a little bit. And so it'll enable that debugging toolbar. So it's quite nice. It knows that you're not going to be debugging unless you're attached. So it's not going to waste your kind of toolbar space with that in the meantime. So yeah, once this is finished, it's taking a little bit of time to build, apologies. But once it does build, you'll see that we get an extra toolbar here for debugging. And you'll also notice that this bottom section of the screen changes as well. We get new windows. At the bottom, we've currently just got output. But you'll see once we have attached, it will show a couple of other windows which are more useful for debugging. There we go. So we've got the orange bar at the bottom. We've got this diagnostic tool stuff on the right. We're going to learn how to turn that off because unless you need it, again, just turn it off. It will launch automatically every time you attach otherwise, and it's a bit of a pain in terms of taking up window space. But we've also got some auto locals windows. We'll talk a bit more about these in a bit. And we've got our call stack and breakpoints. So there's a bunch of different things that show up when you are in the kind of when you're attached to a process. And you can see we've got this extra bit of information down here. I tend not to use these, so we're going to play around and turn these off in a moment. But you can see that we have the debug one now enabled, which allows us to stop debugging. It allows us to jump over breakpoints. And we have this debug location one. So that's worth noting that just because when we're not attached, we don't see the debug information, it doesn't mean we need to go ahead and set it up on this screen now. So the debugging, I tend to leave it here so it's next to the debug, the launch debug. You have your stop and your pause right next to it. But there's certain things in this that I don't use, so I'm just going to go ahead and clean it up. I don't use this button. I tend to use the shortcuts, but sometimes it's nice to remind myself of the shortcuts by hovering over them. So yeah, I tend to leave the rest of them on. I think they're all relatively useful. I don't think I use the show next statements, actually thinking about it, but you could always turn it off if you find you're not using the tools. Okay, so we have our debug options up there, and then the final thing I wanted to clean up a little bit was this debug location. This comes up automatically when you're attached, as we saw, but I don't think any of them are really useful for Unreal debugging, for me at least. Maybe it's just the type of work that I'm doing. But the only thing that's interesting really is stack frame, but you can kind of see that from the call stack window that we have open anyway. So personally, I turn all of these off. Unreal runs on like a main game thread. So unless you're doing some extra kind of threaded stuff in Unreal, which isn't really like super common practice, or if you're just a hobbyist dev, then realistically you won't need to mess around with any of the thread-based stuff that we've got here. So you can see it's taking an extra line at the moment based on where I've placed it. So I'm going to try and drag it up here onto the end of this line just to give us that a little bit more space. So that's always my aim really, is to keep this top bar just to one row if I can, to give myself more room to code with, more vertical space on my screen. Okay, so we've kind of set up our toolbars now. There's some options we're going to go through and configure. I know this is a lot of setup stuff, but this is kind of things that I've learned. Once you get more comfortable with using Visual Studio, I've developed using it for, well, professionally for around 3 years, and longer unprofessionally, if we call it that. These are just things that you learn over time, or you feel comfortable enough to switch off because you know that you never use them, you know? So I thought it'd be useful to share some of these, and hopefully it'll give you a bit of screen space back as well, people using it. Okay, let's see what we're going to do next. I think we'll probably have a look at this window that's over here, because we got code files along here. Don't worry so much about those for now. This is just a project that I'm working on. The code that you're seeing on the screen at the moment is not too important. But you will notice a Solution Explorer, and this will show you the different projects that you have. As we're working in Unreal, we'll have UE4 as our engine as a separate project. Very rarely am I ever opening this and having a look in. Now what we've got then is our Cat and Bird project, or whatever the name of your project is. So the main folder I've ever used in here is this source folder. And if you open up the source folder, this is where you'll see pretty much, sorry about the background noise. This is where you'll see pretty much the structure of your code folders. So we've got a private public thing for separating headers and CPP files in this. So if we open this up, we'll see the folder structure that we've got, and you can see the files. Now, one thing it took me a while to learn with the Solution Explorer is that the Solution Explorer isn't just, it's not a reflection of your folder structure. An example of that is I could go straight to this folder on my computer. I could change something and this doesn't reflect it. It's a little bit annoying, and that's where like generating your project files again, or like regenerating the solution can help, or closing and reopening as well. But where this tends to happen for me quite often is if I was to go, let's say I wanted to make a new file in here. So we're going to go add, I want to make a new item. And one thing that's a bit of a shame, I always expect it to open to the folder where I've clicked, but the first time it'll remember where you were last, but first time it always takes you into this intermediate project files. But we're going to go into this folder that I just clicked here. So let's go into Cattenberg, source, Cattenberg, and then private, right? So if I made a new folder in here, and we'll just call this a test folder, and I want to make it in that test folder, and I'm going to call this, once we've selected it, I'm going to call this just a test file, .cpp. We press add. Can you see it's added it at the bottom here as if it's not in a folder? And that's what I mean. These are like filters. It's not a true folder structure. So it's something that was a bit weird for me for a long time. So the thing I learned basically is just don't use Solution Explorer as a replacement for like your File Explorer. And that regenerating or rebuilding that solution file will help you have a more up-to-date version of this. But don't worry, it is in the right place. It's not the end of the world that it's in there. It's just one of those things to be aware of as you're using it. If we wanted to go and check that just to prove that I made it in the right place, where did we have it? In this folder. If I go into source, Cattenberg private, you can see that I do have a test folder and the file is in there. So it's just something to be aware of with the Solution Explorer. So some of the things that took a while, or that confused me with Solution Explorer as well, I sometimes accidentally press this show all files. There's a keyboard shortcut. I think it might be Alt-Shift-P or Alt-Shift-I, which is similar to a Visual Assist shortcut I use very often. And if you press the wrong one, it just changes to this view, which shows you literally every single file. which, I mean, in smaller projects it may not be an issue, but it can be a bit of a mess sometimes. And if you don't know how to get back to it, it can be a bit confusing. So yeah, that's all that this button up here does. This show files. The preview file, preview selected item, that basically means when you click on it, it'll open that up. Can you see it's in a preview tab? We'll talk a bit more about tabs in a little bit, but the preview tab's up here. Just that means that you're going to see it now, but if you don't actually use it or click in it, it doesn't open it as an existing tab for you. Now this one, it is a proper tab, and that's because I already had that file open. So yeah, that can be useful, but if you don't want it to jump every time that you click it, you can just turn that off, and that'll allow you to just click about without the code file changing. So that's one thing that's useful for it. You can use filters in here as well. If I remember correctly, there's a way for you to kind of filter that. You can search for stuff, but generally, most of the time I don't use Solution Explorer because I tend to just search for files in different means. And what I mean by that is you can do Control-T. And you can go ahead and you can just type anything here. So if I wanted to look for board tile widget, I can just start looking for it. And it shows me everything where board tile shows up. And if I want to just look for files, I can use Control-Shift-T and it'll take me just to look for files. I tend to navigate that way rather than searching through a Solution Explorer personally. But each to their own anyway. Fyro asking in chat, did I just drop a large amount of frames by clicking that button? Probably. I haven't set up, I think you can go into the settings to say how many cores of your CPU is allocated to certain things. It's the same with like generating, like when it scans your projects for IntelliSense and Visual Assist, that extension I use also does that sort of logic. When it does that, if you don't try and control how much of your cores it takes, it can really take a lot of your CPU, and if you're streaming at the same time like me, it can cause some issues as well. But it's all good. It's all good. You just miss me clicking a few places, if anything. All right. So that was the Solution Explorer. There's one thing at the bottom down here. There's a few things that are kind of useful. If we go to Class View, now I personally don't use it, but it's actually quite useful. If you go into your selected project in here, again, I'm probably dropping frames while it does all of this loading. Sorry if so. But this allows you to have a look at all of the different classes in your project. So it's kind of like, it can probably be more, it's useful if you have multiple classes within one file where the file name alone isn't enough to search. But also what's pretty cool about it is if we open up one of these, it gives you information about what it derives from as well, which can be quite useful. So yeah, it can be quite useful just to have a general overview of what's here, right? But and you can also see derived types. I think that's quite useful. So what's the base type of this one? So A card base. When you click on them as well, when you get to this root element, can you see at the bottom? This is one of the most important things. You get to see like all of the functions in it. So it's quite nice to kind of be able to look through and see, this is the sort of stuff that's in it without going through the whole file. If I'm honest with you, with CPP, you generally can just jump into the header and you get an idea of the classes, the structure anyway, you know. But it still may be useful for some people who like using like the mouse and to use this side menu as well. Grumpy Game Dev in chat is saying, I don't use class view because I'm a one class per file, and also all of my classes are just really namespaces for static member functions. Oh, right. Well, it depends on your development, right? It depends on what language and kind of engine and your framework that you build and how you build it. But it may have a use to some people. So yeah, class view, this is really nice. There's a similar thing in Visual Assist that I use, which is a VA outline. I'll show some of the Visual Assist stuff at the end of the stream. But it just gives you a very nice summary of like, here's all the members, here's all the functions. It can be super nice when you're working in someone else's code base and you're just trying to get a kind of grasp of how things are set up without having to switch between header and the CPP all the time. But yeah, that can be useful. And as I said, it shows derived classes, something that I find pretty useful. So if we go to a card base in here and we go into derived types, we can go ahead and say, oh, okay, so there's 3 different classes that come off of that. And then you can look, okay, what about all the different slot cards I have in the game? And there's a ton of them. So it's kind of nice to see that structure sometimes. But I will show you another tool I use later, which is super handy for when you're working with a class to find out, well, what does this inherit from, or is there anything that derives from this that you can do using Visual Assist 2. Okay, so yeah, that was the class view. Property, I'd never use this. You can close down the property manager as far as I'm concerned. I'll go ahead and do that. And also, if you're using version management, then this is actually useful. I use a different client. I just to do my versioning, just because I've been used to doing that. But once I have hooked up my VS to it, you can see that it is detecting kind of what branch I'm on, and it detects any changes I've made. I've added this file called test file, for example. So it is quite nice. So if you do want to use the kind of built-in versioning stuff, that tab is quite useful to have open as well. So for now, I'll leave it open, but it depends on your practice and even if you're doing versioning, right? You do also have some info down here about your kind of projects and how they hooked up to version management or version control, right? So that can be useful. Okay, so that's the Solution Explorer for you. I tend to, as I said to you, it's not something I'm using all the time, but like some of these buttons as well, they don't really provide a huge amount. So the filters can be useful. This one, so for example, open files filter. So that will change out of everything that we're viewing. It will only show the ones that I have open in a tab somewhere. There could be a chance that I've got quite a lot of the files open. Oh no, it's currently working. So there we go. This list has been reduced now because it's only showing the ones that are open. That can be useful in situationally, but generally I just tend to use tabs in a clever way instead. So it's not a huge deal for me. So Solution Explorer for me, it's quite nice to find things or kind of explore folder structure without going to your actual Windows Explorer. But I tend not to use it a massive amount. So what you can do, you can just kind of pin it away so that it doesn't take up that screen space. And you can see that each one of these, then you can just click when you need it. You can scan through and do what you need. And when you click away, it'll hide itself again. So the pinning tool is quite useful. The collapse. So Grumpy Game Dev, that's a fair point. We'll have a look at that. So is the collapse all? Is that one of the buttons, or is it just right click and then collapse all? I've done that in other things, but I've not actually done it in here. If you want to give me some feedback in chat, let me know where you do the collapse all. Oh, is it just shift click or something like that? Yeah, oh no, it's not. It's at the top. Collapse all, there we go, yeah. So if you do that, it will collapse everything down. And what's nice about that then is it's not just it doesn't collapse it all and then once you open it, it's all expanded. It's all of the folders have been collapsed down as well. So it's a nice way to clean up if you've been going through a bunch of stuff. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. That is a good thing. Okay. So we've got a couple of extra things that I wanna talk through. So we've already talked a bit about like pinning toolbars and that away. So we are going to come to that in a moment, but I just want to go through some options which are useful to set up for Unreal development with Visual Studio. So first off, the error list. So if you compile and there's a problem, you will see the wonderful error list. Now in something like C#, this is wonderfully useful. It warns you when something's wrong. It tells you descriptively what is wrong. However, due to the way that Unreal Engine works, there's a bunch of macros, there's a bunch of, and with CPP generally, the kind of IntelliSense side of things isn't always the most useful. And so the errors that we get in this error list really aren't too useful most of the time as well. So what my typical kind of workflow is if I was to change some code so that it doesn't work, let's just lose a bracket off of here, for example, and then I try and build this. So what happens is we just look at the output and I use that to determine where the kind of errors are. So we'll see, here we go, we've got a bunch of errors. Sometimes you can get a lot of text in here depending on how many kind of actions that it needs to compile separately. One thing I like to do is do Control F within here and then search for the word error. and that helps you spot all the times that it says errors. That'll help you identify the bits you need to read. Now, this doesn't mean that I've got 9 errors or 10 or however many there. It's a series of errors, right? One thing causes more things to error, or sometimes it gives you on multiple lines different kind of bits of information that you can use to understand what the error is. So yeah, one error might be listed as 45 errors, as Grumpy Game Dev says. It definitely takes some getting used to, but this is what I use. Now, I think it's default in the installation that it will show the error list automatically when you compile. The error list is this thing here, this error list. Now, this is where like you'll get a list of stuff. Like sometimes it's right, don't get me wrong, but generally when you're compiling, you want to make sure that you've got the option off that this doesn't automatically show. So the way to do that, if we just go into our tools and our options, if you go into build and solutions, or project and solutions, sorry, this tick box here, I don't think it's on anymore because I've reset to default and this is off, but this is something that I personally recommend turning off with your Unreal Visual Studio development. Otherwise, it will always bring up this window. Even if you close it and then compile again, if it doesn't work, it will then bring up that error window for you. So we're just going to close down that error window and we don't need to see that again, which is useful. Now, within your Solution Explorer, something that we talked about quite recently, you can actually clean up. It's not a massive deal, but it's something you might want to set up the first time you're going through this. Within your options as well, you can disable external dependency folders. So this will just turn off some of the folders that aren't really related to what you're going to be ever selecting in here. So it's something that I tend to generally do. You can go in there into options, then into text editor. Where are we? Text editor. You can also search in the options, which is super handy as well. So if I just go text editor by here, this gives you the kind of results in here. So it's in the CPP section in here, I believe, and then in the advanced section in here. And this is all of our list of things. So you can turn off disable external dependencies folder, which is in here somewhere. You can, once again, I could search for that exact option. The search tool is pretty nice in here. But right, so let me find it quickly for you. I like how I said you can search for it using the tool up here, but I'm like, nah, I'm gonna do it myself instead. Let's try typing it in just to see if it will find it usefully for us. Disable external dependencies. Okay, it's definitely, we're in the right bit, but it doesn't show you exactly where the option is, which is a bit of a shame, but it's because you just do it once and then you never have to do it again. I'm probably looking in the IntelliSense bit rather than... There we go. That's what we're looking for. This one here. So if you can turn this to true, that will mean that it will get rid of... It won't be massive. You're not going to notice a massive difference. But you can see this just changed and something it got a little bit shorter, because we've removed that now, and it just gets rid of one or two things, but it's nice to set it up once at the start. Okay, and then there's one more thing I wanted to show. So there's things that you can show in turn off to kind of speed up the debugging process. So do you remember when I launched earlier, it opened up on the side of the screen, it opened up the profile. It was like a little memory profiling thing. Up on the right side of the screen. Oh, I still have my error. It's not going to launch. Just use your best memory to remember. It brings up some panels on the side. So there's two options you can turn off to make it a little bit more, well, to stop it doing that, which is a performance increase at least for you. So let's have a look where that is stored. So if you go into options, debugging in general. So we're in options, debugging, general. Okay, we've got a big list of them again. But we want enable diagnostic tools while debugging. So I found this one easier. You can turn that one off, and then this one as well, show elapsed time perf tip while debugging. If you turn these off, you don't really use them, and it does improve your performance. It's recommended on the Unreal website as well. Another thing that I've done doing options sometimes is if I want to change the font size, not like you can control mouse wheel to make your actual code font bigger. But sometimes like this output list or your find results, if I go and search for something, let's just do a control F and I just look for, let's say if I do rat, it might be a lot of things in there. Let's just say type in warrior, see if the word warrior comes up. So can you see how large this is? That's gigantic. Now that will change with your zoom in, which is fine. But what you'll notice is the output window doesn't change with your zoom. So if you want to change the font settings for that, if you can go into the options the way I did before, but you can just search here. If I just go font settings, change the font color, yeah, that's probably the one. We go into this window and you choose, you can change fonts and that if you want. But generally here, what I've done, you go into the output window and you can just change the size of this. So if it's a bit small for you, you can change it to be a little bit bigger so it's large, but do keep in mind it's not going to change when you're zooming in and out. But when I'm streaming, it's quite useful. If I'm debugging, it helps chat be able to see like what am I trying to understand. So Littlewood, welcome to chat. Nice to see you today. How's your Sunday been, good sir? And Grumpy Game Dev, anything you find that you found useful on any stuff I'm showing as well, do feel free to share. And a reminder as well, so I'm using Visual Studio Community 2019. This stream is showing how you can use that for Unreal Engine development. If you want to know more about the Microsoft Game Stack, this is a sponsored stream, as you can see from the top right, and that you can find information in there. Click the link. It's literally, I've been there. I can assure you it's nothing too bad. There's 2 links to teach you more about the Microsoft Game Stack and to link to the YouTube channel about the Microsoft Game Stack as well. So yeah, go ahead and click if you're interested. I like 150% zoom for my code window, says Grumpy Game Dev. It's good for stream and good for 47-year-old eyeballs. Yeah, that works. Littlewood, you said I've been trying to make a game for your Game Boy Jam, but I've run out of time, so I'm just practicing for Ludendare Jam next weekend. Indeed, LD is upon us, ladies and gentlemen. I'm looking forward. I've booked 2 days off for the Monday and then a recovery day on the Tuesday, so it should be good. I like a good game jam. Yeah, so Brainerd, you mentioned the control and the comma. I've got a whole section on little shortcuts later, so we will talk about that. That is on my list of things to show. Thank you for saying, Brain. We will have a look at how that works later. So that was changing the options. The last thing we did was just set the font settings. I'm going to be honest with you, this is a little bit vulgar how big it is, so I'm just going to change it back to, it was 9. We'll put it at 10. It's still small, but I'm not squinting and frowning all the time, at least, right? So what I wanted to show you in the options, the other thing I want to show you now, this is the last bit of setup in Visual Studio, if I'm honest with you, is just how you can move around windows and kind of get it set up as you want. And this follows on from some of the stuff I showed you with Solution Explorer earlier, how you can just pin things out the way. So pinning is super handy, as is dragging and rearranging your windows. So because I don't use Solution Explorer that much, and because my project isn't massively vast, I tend to feel like I don't really want this bottom left section of the screen to be taken up by the Solution Explorer. So one thing that I tend to do is to try and rearrange it so that it actually, this window goes across, and then I can split this window in half and get more information out. So for example, let's do this. So I can just click and drag. I can whack this on the side of this window instead, and then this takes up less room. I can still pin it to the side, so there's no issue there. But what it gives me is when I do have it open, it means that it's not taking less of this window at the bottom. And typically when you're coding, you try and code in a way where you don't have massively long lines. We don't really respect it a lot in this project, but you tend to have a kind of rough limit of how long your lines are. But when you're using these windows, like the output log, when you're debugging, you get these really long lines, and sometimes you want to separate these out. So one window I like to add on is the bookmark window, something that's super handy that we're going to talk a little bit more about later, but I'll just add it on for now just to show you as an example. So if I go to, I think it's in view, isn't it? View, and then there should be a bookmark window. Yeah, there it is. So if we click on that, you can now see that I've got a bookmarks bar as well. I'll talk more about these later, as I said, but the reason I wanted to open it is to show you that, well, you can then split this. Now that I've got this extra space, we still want it on the bottom, but let me just, hold on. Let me just open this back up, pin it up. But what I want to do is I want to drag this across to be on the side of this window So then I can keep my bookmarks over here, so I can jump around code to bits that I want to. I tend to just put descriptive names in here, so I don't really need to know where it is. So I can just keep a little list over here of places I want to jump to. And then this bit I use over here for like my debugging the errors, or if I'm looking for search results of certain terms. So this is where we looked for the word warrior earlier. We can click on these, and I'm going to go through how this find window works later. So that's one thing I like to do. The other thing is I sometimes do find it handy just to pin these windows down out the way to give us more kind of vertical space in our window. You can always click them to open them up periodically, and then when you click off it, it'll close. But when I'm debugging, I tend to always have it open. But if I'm writing code, I tend to close it down just to give me a bit less distraction. There is a shortcut to go into full screen mode as well. I'll show you that later. And it's really good for focusing. It gets rid of a lot of the toolbars, and you can just kind of, if you need to write some code without seeing the rest of the UI, it's pretty handy. So Littlewood is saying that GameMaker needs proper bookmarks because you lose them when you close the app. That is a shame. Yeah, bookmarks, even when I reset my VS settings, it keeps these, which is nice. So, yeah, it's very handy, very handy. You notice you can actually pin down certain parts of it. So you can see that I pinned down the bookmarks earlier because it's in a separate window. It'll just sit on the bottom there. But let's get it back to how I had it anyway. So that's one thing I like to change. I forgot to look where this is, but there's definitely a nice scroll bar you can put on as well. So the scroll bar is pretty useful. The times I tend to use it is if I search for something. So say I look on this screen for return, right? Then all the results that you find are going to be highlighted in this kind of brown maroon sort of color. And so it's quite useful sometimes to find like, where's the first place that this was used? I find it pretty useful. It's also useful to know, have I actually included something? So if I'm using like what type is this? So this is a U card game party. So if I just do a Control F on U or card game party, you see all the instances of it, and up here that makes me think I probably have included it. So I can click all the way up there, and there we go. You can see I've got an include, so it's fine for me to use that. So it's pretty good when you're debugging or when you're trying to compile, sorry, and you're getting issues like, oh, have I not included it? That's a quick way to check if you don't want to go back up to the top. But we can change this scroll bar to be a little bit more useful as well. So actually, I think you right click on the scroll bar. You can go straight into the settings for it. Scroll bar options. Yeah, and in here you can do, where is it? Use bar mode, that's the one. Map mode for vertical scroll bar. So if you take that instead, is that the one? Yeah. Okay, so this gives you like your little preview of everything. So what I prefer about this is you can just click and drag. On the other scroll bar, you've got to click the bit that moves to drag it. But one, this lets me just quickly like click up here to see the top and then click back. It also like highlights like changes in your document. So if I was to write, you can see I get this little marker on the side saying that I've changed it. You can see that you get the markers on this preview bit as well. So it does make jumping around a larger code file a little bit easier, which is nice. So I'm just going to Control Z to undo those so we don't have those errors there. And the other things you're seeing is these breakpoints as well. They will show up on there as well. You see I no longer have a thing there. If I go down there, I'll see that's from my find result. So it'll flag different things, but I find that map mode really handy. And also if you hover, it lets you see it as well. So you can even like check for things without having to change where you're at. So that map mode is pretty useful on the scroll bar. And then if we go over to this right side, you can see that we've got some things pinned away. I don't use these. If you're doing stuff with server-based stuff, it'd be great. But if not, then you don't really need them open. Like the toolbox I've used before for when making C# applications to like drag out your win form. Don't need to be doing anything with that at the moment. I tend to just close all of these down. If you ever need it, you can just go and find it and reopen it. That's generally how I find things work. Let's catch up with chat briefly. So Brainerd, yeah, I have the same issues with log categories in Unreal. I disable all and filter the one I want every time I open the app. Probably there's a way to fix that. Oh, is that so you can only see the one that you want, you mean? Brainoid, what, within Unreal Engine? Yeah, I do that same thing where you just disable all and then enable the only log. There is something you can set in the ini to say, you can set up log verbosity, I think it's called, where you declare, when you declare a new log type, you can give it a verbosity level. And then you can change it so when you're running the game, it only logs stuff that meets the verbosity rules. That might be something that would help or be worth looking into in that. But I've never done it in my own personal projects, but I know they've done it on some of the professional projects I've worked in before. Because I was wondering why I couldn't find my log, and it turns out it wasn't important enough apparently. Okay, so yeah, we were just going through tidying up the last bits of our interface before we go into looking at kind of tips while using Visual Studio as a code editor. So a couple of things then that I wanted to talk about was the tabs. When you start a new project, you'll have like 2 files open. It's fine. When you start working in a big code base with other people, and then you end up having to open files just to see how stuff works, even if you're not changing it, it can get a bit of a mess. And you can see what we've got up here is if I press on this down arrow, it'll show me every single tab that I've currently got open. This is not good. I don't know how it works memory wise, but I like to try not to have too many things open at once. And when we're in this nice tab mode, it'll just keep adding them, and once there's too many to show, it'll just hide them off under this arrow. But generally I like to keep on top of it, and I'll show you how I kind of manage my tabs. One of the main features I use is this pinning. So if I was going to be working on this file that I was in earlier, let's say, I would pin this one. Now what that does by default is it just moves it to the left side. So you see this one's pinned by the shape of the pin is pointing down rather than sideways, and this one's pinned. The rest of them are not pinned, but it doesn't really make them stand out a great deal. And so one of the things I like to do, we do lose a bit of vertical space doing this, but if you go into the settings for it, you can put in some settings that will make these stand out a lot more. And this bit here, show pinned tabs in a separate row. If you do that, well, that puts them all on the top. Now, you know you're in a bad place if you end up filling your pinned row with more that fits on the screen as well. But that's something that really helps me know that anything underneath is kind of like reference material, and then the ones at the top are the new files that I'm working on, or maybe my current checked out files. If I'm working in a version managed piece of code, I find that super helpful to manage my flow. There's some more settings in here that you may want to play around with as well. You can choose like where new tabs go. You can actually change, tabs can be on the side if you prefer to keep the vertical space. I tried it for a while, but I couldn't get used to it. So this maintain pin status if removed from the well. This I should have on because it annoys me almost daily in work. If I have that on, what it means is if I drag it away from there, it still is pinned, and if I drag it back, it'll go back to pinned. That is off by default. So what happens is I tend to, if I want to put one code on one window on one screen as a reference, or if I'm just trying to spread my work out for visual space on different screens, I'll drag it off, but then it will completely forget that it was pinned. And then when you drag it back on, it goes into the myriad of other files that you've got open. So that's one thing to be aware of. Was there anything else in that settings that we particularly cared about? So there's a thing called previewing that we saw a bit of earlier. You can turn that off and control that in there as well. The thing where if we have this on, that it'll do a preview of it. The problem is I have these files opened already, so it's not doing a preview. It does that. That's a preview. These little arrows here, this will show you if you've got it open as well. It's basically a carrot to open up and show you what's in there. I shouldn't have clicked that. Please don't die, stream. Yeah, that's an indicator sometimes that you've got the file open or not. But yeah, the preview is where it'll open on the right of all your tabs. It'll have this little button here, and you can click it to say, oh, I want to keep that open. But otherwise, if you click on another file, it's gone, and it doesn't add to that memory. So enabling preview is quite useful if you're only kind of referencing files. It can be pretty handy. The other thing I'd recommend is ways to close them. There's I don't know if you're like me, but I tend to organize my my tabs in order of things that I'm using, or logical, like I'll put headers and footers together. not headers, sorry, headers and CPP files together. Or I do like, here's all the stuff for the character grouped together, and then I'll do all the stuff for the enemy if I'm working on both of them, and just so I can jump around the files a bit easier sometimes if I'm clicking away. So if you're doing that, then some of these options are pretty good for closing tabs. So you can close all tabs. You can do close all but this, which will close every tab other than that window. And then you can do close all but pinned as well. So it allows you to close your tabs in a way which it doesn't mean you have to go and close off every one of them. So one of the main things that I tend to do is just close all but pinned. I'll pin everything I need, and then I can just go ahead and just close all but pinned, and they all close down. And now I haven't got like 30 files opened at once. And if I want to open files up again, then I just go ahead and open them up again. So if you're working in this sort of environment, if you don't know the name of your files, then Solution Explorer can be handy so that you can jump to the different files as you're going forward. Okay, so yeah, that's how I work with tabs. Let's just go, well, I guess we can open a few more files. I'll use that Control-Shift-T that I said earlier, a way to navigate files. So if we just go into like character, oh, actually it's going to be a card game character, I think they're called. Character card, there's one. We'll open that one up just so we've got a couple of another row of tabs underneath. You can see which ones are pinned and which ones are not. Okay, the final few things then that I want to show then. So first off, this bookmarks window. So bookmarks are super handy in my opinion, and they just allow you to put like key points in code that you find yourself revisiting. Now, how I found myself using these in work is if I've had to dig, like I was doing something on the movement component in Unreal Engine, and you kind of debugging to find like where does the bit happen that I'm interested in, because there's a lot of flow between different classes and that. And you might find this key bit of logic that you were debugging. Now, I might need to go back to that in a month, and I'll probably forget all of that by the time I get there. And so me personally, sometimes I like to use bookmarks for these kind of like, this is where this certain bit of code happens, and I know I might want to go back there in future. And the other reason I do it is if I'm jumping around quite a lot between different areas, how I can just jump back to the key bits. And so they're easy enough to add. You just, when you're there, I think you press Control and then you can tap K twice, and that will add. So if we wanted to add one here for the setup character, Control K 2 times, and then it adds a bookmark. By default, it doesn't give it a name, but you can see where it is. But personally, I think you get most use out of them if you name them. So I just go ahead, and this would be like setting up character card. Now, it's not the most useful one to have, don't get me wrong, but still, it just allows you then, you can jump between any of these at any point, and it makes it a bit easier to jump between key parts as you're working. So yeah, bookmarks are great. You can also, you can assign, you've got these up here if you don't have the bookmark window open, but I like to have it at least available to me to look through, to jump around. But you can just jump to next bookmark. If you're only using 2 maybe, or a few of them, you can just cycle through them at a hotkey press as well. So F2 I think it is, and Shift F2. So that'll take you through your different bookmarks. So it's pretty handy in my opinion at least. Now there's a window called the call hierarchy as well. And this is something I feel I probably should use more. But also it can kind of lock up your Visual Studio if you use it at the wrong time. Because how a call hierarchy works, we'll open up the window. So if we go into view, is it in here, call hierarchy? Yes. So here it says right click on a member name in the code editor and then click view call hierarchy to view the members call hierarchy in this tool window. I said hierarchy a lot in that last sentence. So essentially it's a way of you select a function and you just see, well, where is this called? So if we right click, we're going to say view call hierarchy, and then you get presented with these options. We want to see calls to turn card and calls from turn card. Calls from is less useful in my opinion. This just shows you all the functions that are called from it. It can be quite a lot, so that's what I mean. Be careful of looking in there. If you've gone on a function like a tick function which does a bunch of stuff, it can take a bit of a time to load through. But the calls to are quite useful. This will look through and see where in your code is calling this function. So I normally achieve this by just doing a Control F to find, or Control Shift F to find, or find all references, and another thing I'll show you in a bit. You can do that to find it, but I find this is particularly useful because it means there's less filtering through a big list of find results, which might just be finding text as well, and it'll literally just show you the bits that you're particularly interested. So we can see there's two places that call turn card. It's in this function reveal card and unreveal card. Great. And then if you want, you can go ahead and kind of well, not recursively, but you can go down and down and down as you need to. But yeah, I find that quite useful sometimes, just to know, okay, if I'm changing this logic, what calls it? It can protect you sometimes. Generally, if you're using like protectors like private and public accesses correctly, then you don't want to worry too much about changing the logic in a function. But at the same time, it's quite nice just to be able to get a list of those things. So the normal way I do it is just Control F and find it. But this is a tool that some people might find useful. Because you've got to right click and go into it, I tend not to keep the window open. It seems a bit redundant to keep a window open all the time for that. Other than that, though, yeah, I think that's pretty much all of the kind of setting up your editor, at least, that I wanted to go through. So hopefully there's been a few little pointers that of setting it up, making sure that you feel that your editor's clean, that you're in an environment where you're not got clutter on the screen that you don't know, that you don't need. So me personally, I'd probably get rid of this Solution Explorer. I'd probably minimize these tabs as well. Or maybe I'd keep the bookmarks open, and then I'd just work away. And I'd be using shortcuts on the keyboard normally to navigate around the code. And that's what this next section is going to be about. So I'm just going to take a quick stretch your legs break, and we'll come back and we're going to have a look at using VS while coding. And this is going to be more about lots of the nifty things that you can do with shortcuts that are hidden away. So for example, I could hold Alt and I can use the arrow keys to move lines around. Lots of little shortcuts like that get useful when you're writing code. All right, we'll be back in just a few moments. Going to stretch my legs. I'll see you again soon. And just a quick reminder, if you are interested in learning about the Microsoft Game Stack, there is a link. Please do click and have a look. Visual Studio is part of that game stack. It's all of the kind of Microsoft kind of tools and software and services that are available to kind of help people make games or facilitate certain aspects of games. So yeah, do feel free to check it out. And as you can see at the top of the stream and in the stream title, this is a sponsored stream as well, just to make sure people are aware of it. But this is something I do. I work in Unreal as my day job. I stream Unreal game development. I kind of find it was a nice opportunity to do something that shares stuff that I've known. It's like a knowledge share, so I was very happy to do this. But yeah, we'll be back in just a few minutes.